I may not have all the right answers, or somebody else may not have the right answers, but the fact that in this country we allow people to exchange different viewpoints is what creates America and makes it such a great country. We learn from our mistakes, right? When we build something, a mistake actually is not a mistake. It's another way of not doing something. It teaches us a lesson, and what may be a mistake on one hand may be able to be utilized in another form on some other project. What happens is then if somebody says this can't be done, you know, that's the fence, people go, oh, okay, that can't be done. But it can be done. But you have to be able to think beyond that.
Welcome back, everyone. Now we're here in the Mojave Desert, sitting with an interesting character. It's Art Thompson. You might have seen Red Bull Stratos, this space jump. He was the one who invented and built that capsule. Now he's the president of Sage Cheshire Aerospace and has done some very interesting work in Hollywood with different types of commercials you may have seen, some interesting technologies, worked on the B-2 stealth project, you name it. And Art, it's a real pleasure being here with you.
It's great to meet you too. Really an honor.
What I want to talk about is, you of course work in aerospace. We've seen stories, for example, of the Chinese Communist Party stealing American intellectual property, and actually a lot of stories recently specifically about aerospace. But when we get into STEM education, science, technology, engineering, I mean, really them, and even going back to the Soviets, they were a lot better than us on that type of education. But they still need to steal American innovation within those categories. And I want to talk to you about why that is. Now, if you could tell us first off, kind of some of the work you've done. I know you did the Red Bull Stratos project. Just give us some of the idea of some of the work you've done.
It's a big mix. I mean, from some of the early aerospace stuff that I worked on with programs with Northrop for things like the B-2 stealth bomber, and a number of other programs. There are actually probably 16 different programs. I think 3 of them were public knowledge. From there got into doing some movie projects with like Batman and Robin and X-Files and Contact, different things like that. Hover cars for Total Recall. So we had people who knew me from the Northrop days who worked at NASA and back to A to Z. I had somebody contact me when Red Bull first came to the United States, and they wanted to make a vehicle. And so I turned them down for like a year and a half and eventually said, okay, we'll build your vehicle. After we built the one, then they wanted 25, they wanted 150. So that relationship grew. Eventually we ended up building over 1,000 vehicles for Red Bull. And in the process, we were also doing aerospace work through NASA, had us building some parts and components for them for different things up at Edwards Air Force Base. So kind of in parallel, these two companies. Felix had, with Red Bull, was interested in you know, do you know Joe Kittinger? And I said, yeah. He says, well, if you were going to break Joe's record, how would you go about breaking Joe's record? I said, well, it's 3:30 in the morning. Let me give you a call back. So that was kind of the start of Red Bull Stratos, putting a proposal together.
So they called you 3:30 in the morning and said, how would you break this?
Yeah, so I ended up writing an 87-page proposal, which we took to Dietrich Mateschitz, the owner of Red Bull, and presenting the idea of doing Red Bull Stratos. Sage Cheshire, at the same time, we're doing work for Northrop, Boeing, Lockheed. We build tail cone sections for missile avoidance for Gulfstream. So these two parallel companies, which kind of complement each other, but also need to be kept separate because one is more automotive development, special effects, viral videos, and the other one is all serious of aerospace.
Yeah, so we saw, for example, you did this Humvee that elevates itself and goes over cars.
So HumRider.
We saw in your office here the armor and little frisbee thing of Xena Warrior Princess. You have some, I mean,
everywhere you look,
have
there's
just about
something.
everything.
Yeah. So you know, a lot of the viral videos are good, and so people tend to come to us because we're able to get things done quickly. We're good at thinking outside of the box, a lot of creative thinking. I kind of attribute that to when I was a kid. My parents taught biology, chemistry, and physics. So at a very early age, I got a very good science education at 5, 7 years old. I started seeing a lot of this. And but at the same time, a lot of art involvement, a lot of music. So it was a lot of creative thinking. There was a lot of exposure. My parents helped start the Sonora Wild Desert Museum. So, I have pictures of my mom when she was pregnant with me sitting with her mountain lion that ended up being the mascot of the museum.
She had a pet mountain lion?
Yeah, she had a mountain lion. We had hawks, we had rattlesnakes, so very strange childhood, a lot of exposure to interesting people and exposure to science, to art, which creates kind of a creative thinking. I always say with kids, you can never expose them too young. People are like, oh, they're too young. No, you can never expose a kid too young because the synapse in their brain is formed in the first years of development of a child. And the more you stimulate that, the more brain growth you're going to see. And so exposing kids at an infant is something that should be encouraged. Creative thinking, getting them, don't just give them a video babysitter, just don't push them off to the side. Take them around, have them experience things at a very early age, because it helps to create creative thinking, which goes back to kind of the ideas of, in some of the Soviet or Chinese or communist countries, they're so conformed with a process thinking that they stagnate the creative side of your brain.
Actually, this is what I really want to get into. Now, I have a friend, for example, grew up in the Soviet Union when he was younger, and actually he immigrated to the United States later on in life. And he said in the Soviet Union, the math
is amazing.
Classes they were way better than what we have in the United States. And when he came here, he kind of felt like he wasn't learning anything. But he said what he learned in American schools were the social skills.
The social, right.
And he felt school was more like a social environment. But he says, looking back now, he felt that was actually more valuable. But this brings us to the question of, these countries, China, the Chinese Communist Party now, and going back to the Soviet Union, relied heavily on intellectual property theft. When, if you're talking about STEM, you would think they'd be better at this than us. What are they missing?
Well, it's so much easier to plagiarize somebody's idea to get a baseline concept. If you're in a society that's not used to creative thinking, we learn from our mistakes, right? When we build something, a mistake actually is not a mistake. It's another way of not doing something. It teaches us a lesson. And what may be a mistake on one hand may be able to be utilized in another form on some other project. If you're channeling your thinking into a very structured way of thinking, you never get that exposure. Today's generation wants the instant gratification. So you can look up on Google and get the answer. So if you're always given the correct answer, you're never given the opportunity to think outside of the box. If you make a mistake, then you have to analyze the mistake and think about how I can change that process to create a success, to create a better way of doing it. But if you're constantly being fed the book form of what we're given every day, what you see pop up on Google, it's great for ideas, not to put it down, because if you want to learn what the standard process is, you can see that. But what happens is then if somebody says this can't be done, that's the fence, people go, oh, okay, that can't be done. But it can be done. But you have to be able to think beyond that. And so if you're in a structured kind of society where they've taken away kind of the free thought process, you're channeled into doing things a particular way. In our society, sometimes in universities and colleges, it's a little bit too much, you know, on the social activity and not drilling into the importance of why the math, you know, needs to be a solid foundation, or why the science needs to be a solid foundation. There's too much partying a lot of times in American universities, but it's really important to have that social interaction. It worries me that our current generation is losing part of that communication, because when you're texting and when you're doing everything digitally, you don't get facial responses. You and I can read emotion. We can give a simple expression and you know immediately what you're thinking. You can communicate through that visual. But if you're not raised to see that social interaction, then you lose a huge part of our communication. It also, constantly being fed, spoon-fed the right answer, makes you be very impatient to the process. So imagine telling the millennium today, we're going to build pyramids, and it's going to take about 4 generations before you're going to see the end result. You know, you look at JPL. Some of those people work their entire career and never see what they built being used. They're in retirement, and then they see what it is, you know, landing on another planet or going out into space. And so you have to be able to look at creative thinking and thinking outside of the box. It's important.
You know, you mentioned something interesting, which is the idea that people will see a boundary and believe that the boundary is impassable. It reminds me actually of an old story I heard about Christopher Columbus, actually,
Yes.
that they had this saying, something like no plus ultra, nothing beyond, when it came to the furthest place west on, you know, the European shores. And the king, you know, whoever it was, tore that down basically and built a monument. I think it's Hercules with the pillars, actually.
Yeah.
Might be. I can't remember. But he said plus ultra, right? Beyond the, you know, boundary.
Right.
The idea that you can have something beyond the limits of where you believe the limits are, and that was such a, you know, it's a concept that has a real spirit behind it, to believe that you can go beyond the frontier. And it really, whether it's entertainment or sci-fi or the cowboys.
And there's so many examples of that, because you look at like the Olympics is the perfect example. You can only run this fast. Oh wait, no, you can only run this. No, wait, you can only run this fast. We teach our children to have boundaries. If you took a child and you didn't tell them there are boundaries, they would do amazing things. But we teach them not to learn, because we tell them that no, this can't be done. Red Bull Stratos was a really good example. Was that constantly I was being told something couldn't be done or couldn't happen, and there were roadblocks all the way. And if I would have believed any one of the 100 things that they told me couldn't happen, it never would have happened. But you have to go beyond that. Don't take no as the answer. Figure out what the solution is. One of my sayings is, don't give me excuses, give me solutions. Because there's always a way to figure out how to make things work.
Well, this is another way to look at this. We talk about thinking outside the box. I think people these days, when you mention Google and they search for answers, it brings a concept that there's only one answer to each problem.
Exactly.
And a lot of modern education, if you go to Europe, for example, a lot of it's based on memorization. And even the way internet works, Google, you know, even these chips people are talking about putting in their brains that give you basically an answer. It creates this concept that there's only one solution and one answer. What do you think the impact is of that kind of thinking?
So the impact of that is huge, because as an example, if you were to have a chip implanted in your brain and you could get the answer for anything you think about, it's great. You know, I want to think about how do I get here? All of a sudden I know what the solution is to get there. But if I want to be thinking about how to make the next light bulb, and it tells me that answer, I may not figure out that an incandescent light bulb isn't the answer I want, it's an LED. because that database may only have an incandescent light bulb. So if you're not allowed to think outside of the box, if you're always being spoon-fed the answer, you're going to say, I've got the solution, on to the next problem, right? So that solution may be good, but it may not be what it's capable of being. And that's with everything we do in life, is that we need to be able to look at the bigger picture, look at how we can reform our way of thinking to be able to create something better, not just settle for the solutions that we've been told, because that may not be the best answer. It may be a solution, but it may be kind of a midline solution that everybody settles for.
You know, it's interesting. I've talked to military guys before. I've interviewed plenty of them over, being a journalist. And one thing really interesting was told to me about trying, when they were going to Afghanistan and trying to train the Afghan forces on, how to think like Americans.
Right.
They had to unravel the Soviet thinking.
Exactly.
Because a lot of them had been trained under the Soviets.
Right.
And the way they were taught is, you follow orders. If you run it, you march and you run into a wall, you wait there for your orders to march around
Right.
it. Whereas the American system, I've heard this told by many officers and so on, going back to the Nazis and the the Japanese or even the Soviets, they got annoyed by Americans because they say that we have standards and protocols, but when actually things hit the fan, all that goes out the window.
Right.
And the American forces become totally unpredictable, actually.
Right, because they start creative thinking.
Exactly.
They're trying to problem solve. They're trying to figure out what the solution could be. And that's not the norm. It's not as structured.
Yeah. And so what is it in the American culture or education system that creates that? Because we can even look, whether it's military strategy, whether it's innovation, whether it's the reason that countries like China do rely so heavily on intellectual property theft. And Americans get made fun of, I think, for kind of being like, the cowboys of the world, so to speak. But there's something within that culture that creates this type of thinking. I'm curious, what do you think that is?
It's really it's a mindset of not being pigeon-toed into a particular place in society. It doesn't matter in America, as opposed to many other countries that are socially set in layers. You're born into this layer, you're going to stay in this layer. You're given this position, you're going to get paid that position forever because you're part of the monarchy in that government structure. In the United States, you can be anybody. You can be the lowest level person and become the president if you really wanted to. You can work your way up through the ranks to be anything. And so kids, I think a big part of it is kids, again, free thinking, they learn to not learn. If you get them to understand that anything is possible, now mentally, socially, their thought patterns are open, and they never would comprehend the fact that there is a limit to what they can accomplish. A person I love to use as an example of the American way, a perfect example of America, is my friend Bob Cardenas. General Cardenas was the guy who dropped Chuck Yeager from the bomber, okay? He was the guy who flew Jack Northrop's Flying Wings. So there's a picture up here of it. And Bob was a Mexican immigrant. He came to the United States at the age of like 5 or 7 as a Mexican immigrant. He came to the U.S. He eventually, when he got older, joined the Army Air Corps and went up to Muroc Air Force, or Muroc Base, which eventually became Edwards. Bob ended up becoming one of the 7 elite fighter test pilots in testing the first jet aircraft in the U.S., the first Flying Wings, all these amazing vehicles. It was Bob Hoover, Chuck Yeager, Bob Cardenas, a number of guys. And so here's this amazing example of a guy that came across the border as an immigrant to this country, ended up joining the Air Force, becoming a test pilot, and eventually became a general in the Air Force. And so it's an example of the American dream that if you understand that there are no boundaries, you can become anything. It doesn't matter. That kind of thinking in the United States of creative thinking, of thinking outside of the box, not being pigeonholed into a particular structure, I think is what really makes America. It's the democracy, it's freedom. We aren't stuck in this slot.
You know, another big point with this is you mentioned failure, right? That failure isn't always failure. Failure is learning what does not work. And, you know, I'm a big fan of Ludwig von Mises, School of Austrian Economics.
Yes.
Great writer. I love his stuff. He actually said something interesting in one of his books, that under socialist and communist systems, what you have is the attempt to eliminate failure or eliminate the possibility of failure. But by doing that, for example, with business through state subsidies, what they do is they subsidize institutional failure.
Right.
Because you have things that should fail, that
Right.
don't work, but that cannot be allowed to fail because they're being propped up, and that never advance because of that.
They support failed thinking, and they again eliminate creative thought by doing it. So in essence, it does the exact opposite of what it's trying to promote.
Whereas in capitalist systems and free countries, failure actually plays a role within the process of success, because a lot of people who are successful have failed many, many times to get there. And what you actually have as well is that when people fail, when there's a possibility of fail, you have the incentive to create something that is naturally sustainable, that can work within, you know, public demand and public interest, and that needs to have that in order to sustain itself.
And the failure is teaching you what didn't work. And based on that, you reformulate your thinking on how it can be better. You look at, you know, the titans in the United States of capitalism, so many of them failed in their businesses over and over again. And it was because they were doing something wrong in their process. And so that failure made them stop and rethink, what do I need to create? What do I need to change? Or sometimes that failure is like, this didn't work, but I could use this failed thing, and it'll actually work in this condition. And so often you can take something that didn't work here, but it opens your eyes to another application. That makes sense.
Yeah. Well, you know, another big part with this too is, I know with yourself, you work with, you know, the military, you work with Hollywood, you work with, you know, big businesses creating commercials and creating products like you did with Red Bull, for example. There's an overlap between the free market and the military. And I know some of your innovations, for example, working just on, like with Red Bull, for example, end up catching the interest of like NASA. Right. Because you innovate in ways that they may not have anticipated. What is the process with this? And I mean, how does this overlap work?
So part of that is also, I say that, you know, one of the downfalls a lot of times to programs is bureaucracy. Going back to kind of what you were saying, was that we structure environments where we have so much, we try and form so much control that we lose control. It'll make a project that could be very short and concise, but we want to over-manage it. So there's a point of management. Everything has to be managed and understood because you're tracking that process. But if you have too much bureaucracy, then it slows the whole thing down. Companies like Boeing, Northrop, Lockheed, NASA, Red Bull, they come to us because we think how to create things quickly. Hum Rider is an example. Here's a car that raises up, the wheels go out, it goes over other cars. So it was a viral video for Verizon. We engineered, designed, and built a hydraulic vehicle that'll do all that in 7 weeks, start to finish. To go to the typical production group or company, it's very hard for them to fast track. We'll do things for Northrop because they realize we can create something faster with less bureaucracy in a shorter period of time. And because we have less bureaucracy, there's actually less cost. We're more cost effective.
I guess just last question. You deal with a lot of people looking for work. You deal with a lot of kids looking into STEM programs. You deal with people who've been educated with science, technology, math, but it's not just that. You also have people who think outside the box. How do you inspire that? How do you help people, within these very regimented forms of education, think outside the box? Because within what you do, both of these sides are necessary.
Some people get it. Like we do intern programs where we teach fabrication methods for building rockets and things like that. And that's really important because hands-on understanding. So we'll get interns from Caltech or from UC Irvine or different schools. And one of the things when I was at Northrop is I insisted that the engineering staff had to also understand how to build things and make things, because it makes you a better engineer. If you're just a book engineer, now you, again, are being spoon-fed what those answers are. And you aren't going to understand the hands-on part of making. So by getting them into the fabrication side where they can be hands-on, make them do composite laminates, whether it's pre-preg or wet, make them run the mill, make them run the water jet, get them involved in the actual fabrication. Now the creative part of their brain comes out, so they're not just looking at the math, they're also looking at what the math means, because that math is something physical. To me, I got excited about math when all of a sudden math became a 3D object, when it became something emotional. You get them involved in how to create and how to build. And the difference is the interns that we work with, and I heard the story so many times, that they ended up getting the job working with NASA or with some aerospace company because they knew more than just the book part of it. They were creatively thinking from having the hands-on experience. They knew how to put something together and why it should be put together that way. So again, it's trying to get people out of that funneled channel and understand that they need to open their mind to the big picture of how it all fits together. Some students never get it. Some are I've seen some brilliant students that in terms of their education and their math, they were superb. But they were unable to interact with other people, realizing that the team will always accomplish so much more by working together and by exchange of creative thinking. And so some of those students, I have problems where I said, it's not just about what you're creating. Your interaction with the other students may actually teach you something you never thought about. It's back to the idea of we learn from our mistakes. And they aren't really mistakes, they're other ways of doing things. There are other processes that point us in the right direction. And so by having that social interaction, back to the idea of working in a democracy where we encourage more free thinking, less regimented, we encourage hands-on, we encourage people to interact. I may not have all the right answers, or somebody else may not have the right answers, but the fact that in this country we allow people to exchange different viewpoints is what creates America and makes it such a great country. That's huge. If you start taking away that freedom and you start taking away the free speech of any of those points of views, then we lose that interaction. Because it may be something that I don't like that helps me to think about how much better I want to be at something else. If I take all those views away, I'm going to go down this very narrow channel, and I may never become what I'm capable of becoming.
Hey, Art, real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
It's really a pleasure to meet you and have the opportunity to talk with you. Thank you.